Hi, everybody. I think we'll give it one more meeting till 12:01 promptly, and then we'll jump right in. All right. With that, we will kick things off. Hi, everybody. My name is Scott Fash. I'm the CEO of BILD Alberta. I'm thrilled to have you here today for our Building Code webinar in advance of the adoption of the 2023 Alberta edition of the National Building Code. So I think we've got about 170 on now. We have 300 register, which is awesome turnout. Joining me to kind of co-present today will be our Director of Building Science, Greg Stanley, who's recently joined us, but we're really excited to have him on board to kind of lead some of the technical work surrounding code. Also joining us is Keith Jansen, who I think most of the folks on this will know, works with Lincolnburg Master Builder. He's also the chair of our Provincial Residential Technical Committee. So yeah, with that, we'll go to the next slide here, Greg. I should mention before we jump in, just as a housekeeping note, given kind of the overwhelming number of folks we do have online and registered, we do ask that you use the Q&A function, which is up at the top. You'll see kind of the menu bar there, top right. If you do have questions rather than the raise hand function, we're going to do our best to answer any and all questions. We are recording this as well, so the intent is any questions we might not be able to answer kind of during the webinar, we will be able to prepare kind of an FAQ or some other resources on our website following it. So yeah, please do use that Q&A function if you do have a question. We'll do our best to get to all the questions that come out there. So for today's session, a few things we're going to be going over here. The first is building code harmonization. Just giving you a bit of an overview or an understanding of how national code becomes provincial code. I'm going to then hand it off to Greg to go over 10 of the key changes that are occurring with this code cycle. Those are really, again, some of those technical changes that we think everybody needs to be aware of in advance of the May 1st implementation date. From there, I'll give a bit of an overview of the tiered energy codes, both where we're at currently and kind of what we expect maybe down the road. We'll then highlight some additional resources that we've prepared as an association and intend to prepare over the next few weeks. And then lastly, we'll go over the future code cycles. So what we're expecting for the 2025 and the 2030 national code cycles. And then obviously we'll end it up with doing our best to again answer any questions. So if we go to the next slide, Greg. So really quickly, for those maybe not familiar, building code is developed by the federal government and Codes Canada. Provincially, we then adopt our provincial version of that code. That's somewhat recent. Historically, you've had provinces kind of develop their own building codes where they would use aspects of a national code. They develop some of their own. They might copy and paste some from other provinces. So it was basically across Canada a bit of a hodgepodge in terms of what building standards and requirements were in place. In the 2010s, through a number of interprovincial agreements related to trade and other requirements, the provinces and the federal government basically agreed to try to harmonize our building codes to the maximum degree possible, try to figure out a way to make them consistent from province to province. And this is what's brought in what's called, again, national code harmonization or auto adoption. So effectively what that means is the federal government develops a code. They then publish it. The intent is that provinces within relatively short order will then adopt that new code provincially. It is important to note that there still is the ability for provinces to make exceptions or variances. So that's still something that we're able to do as provinces. We still have some authority to make those modifications. Like if there's a section of the code that the government of Alberta deems not to make sense for us for whatever reason, they could modify it, they could vary it, they could exclude it if they wanted to. They simply just have to publish those changes. So there still is some autonomy for the provinces to make modifications to that national code where they see fit. But the intent is that all of this kind of happens a lot more quickly than it maybe was done historically. So the intent is, I'd say by 2030, ideally the federal government and provinces are aiming to have basically adopting the provincial version of the code within 1 year that the national code is published. So for instance, there's another code cycle in 2025. The intent is eventually that within 1 year of that, provinces will then kind of be adopting it. Some are going to be a little bit further behind than others, but we expect Alberta to be pretty close within that year timeline. And then lastly, just in terms of feedback, our national body, Canadian Home Builders Association, is actively involved with Codes Canada, providing industry input and feedback on the development of the national codes. So that's both members, volunteer members sitting on committees, as well as a considerable staff contingent from CHBA National providing that input. BILD Alberta also, we put staff resources on a number of those national committees, and we have a number of our members that sit on those committees. And I'll use that as a bit of a plug for anybody who might be interested or willing to sit on either as an observer or sit as a technical member on some federal committees or national committees. We are always looking for some volunteers there, so please do reach out to us if you have some interest. Then provincially, as I kind of mentioned through this auto adoption piece, there are abilities for us to kind of make modifications to that code before we adopt it. So that's typically done through engagement with ourselves and municipal affairs within the government of Alberta. We also work and have representatives on the Safety Codes Council, which is another one of those bodies that provides input to the federal government. I'll go next slide, Greg. So all of this being said, where we are at right now is adoption of the 2023 Alberta edition of the National Building Code. So as I'd mentioned, it's a May 1st implementation date. The key thing I want folks to be aware of is if you get an application or a permit submitted prior to May 1st, you can still abide by that old code. So if you are worried about whether you're going to be compliant with the new code or not, if you get your application in prior to May 1st, you can still abide by that old code. But after May 1, the intent is that new code will be in force. The big item that's been brought in as part of this code cycle are what's called tiered energy codes. And as I mentioned, I'm going to spend a bit more time at the tail end of this presentation going over that. But because there's a variety of other technical changes that are going to impact design and construction. And that's why I want to have Greg go over in a little bit more detail, and they are rather technical. So it is a short implementation and education timeframe. This webinar is one source. We've got a ton of resources available on our website that we've been publishing on a regular basis. We do recommend members go kind of explore that website. We'll have that up on the screen towards the tail end of this presentation as well. Next slide, Greg. So we're going to go over kind of 10 of the key changes right now. And before I hand it off to Greg, just as a bit of a overview, these were reviewed by our Provincial Residential Technical Committee, or our PRTC. So basically, they went through that code line by line to understand what are the core changes that we think will impact members. We rated them based on kind of the impact, the cost, and the frequency, and just again give a sense of what we really thought members needed to be aware of. Next slide, Greg. But with that in mind, we know that some members may be impacted by things we're not discussing today, and we do recommend that all members become aware of these changes through a variety of resources. But ultimately, members will need to refer to that National Building Code 2023 Alberta edition in its entirety for their compliance. But this should serve, we think, as a good starting point for you to understand the implications. So maybe with that, Greg, I'll hand it off to you to kind of go through again some of those 10 key changes.
Awesome. Thank you, Scott. So I'll just get right into it. So the way we're going to go through this is it's going to start with the top rated one and then go down to the 10th. So first up, we have attachment of cladding to walls. So previous versions of the building code did not address specifics for fastening of your vinyl claddings and referenced using the same fastening as you would for metal claddings. So this code change has aligned building code to manufacturer installation specifications that are based off of requirements that were set out by the Vinyl Institute. So important to note for what you're going to see for May 1, horizontal vinyl applications are going to require a maximum fastener spacing of 400 millimeters on center, so that's 16 inches. And it's going to be required to be fastened to framing members, furring members, or blocking between your framing members. So fastening to sheathing alone in this application is not going to be compliant. Where this is going to impact you is traditional construction, where normally you'd be doing a 24-inch on center spacing today, that if you're going to use horizontal vinyl, will need to change down to 16 on center. So then we get into vertical vinyl applications. That will require a maximum fastener spacing of 300 millimeters, 12 inches on center. And your vertical application is also required to be fastened to the same members that I noted for the horizontal application. However, vertical is also going to be permitted to be fastened to sheathing only, where the sheathing is a minimum of 1/2 inch thick plywood or wafer board or 7/16 OSB. So some traditional thicknesses that you'd use today for your sheathing, the 3/8 will not be compliant for fastening to sheathing for vertical. Also, all of your fasteners must be a minimum length of 1.5 inches and will require a minimum embedment of 1.25 inches into the solid material. So if you're attaching vertical vinyl cladding to sheathing, the sheathing thickness will be applicable as long as minimum thicknesses are met based on your materials used. If you are using a gypsum sheathing, the embedment will not include the thickness, so you'll have to increase the length of your fasteners. So since this change has come out, it's prompted a little bit more review, and we have had some member organizations reach out to the Vinyl Institute, and they have been testing other fastener spacings. So there is going to be more to come on this. And we'll definitely keep all members informed as we find further information of different spacing if we can go back to 24. But as of May 1, we will need to adjust to make sure that we are being compliant with the attachment of vinyl claddings. So next, we're going to get into penetrations in a rated assembly. So there's some new requirements for penetrations within rated assemblies. Some things to pay attention to are updated requirements for the continuous barriers in section 910.9.2. Getting into section 910.9.8, it references outlet boxes in concealed spaces. This will require a bit more attention as there are updated requirements for the maximum sizes and required separations. Non-combustible boxes are going to be allowed with a maximum individual area of 24 square inches and an aggregate area of 100 square inches within any 100 square foot of surface area. Your combustible boxes are allowed and must be separated by an enclosure no larger than 465 square inches. So that's approximately 20 inches by 20 inches. And it must be made of a fire block material or located in a space with rock or slag insulation where the sides and back of the outlet are encapsulated by this insulation. These boxes will also have a maximum individual area of 24 square inches. Important to note here is your maximum individual area of 24 square inches. So your typical outlet box is only 8 square inches. So that means you'll have to pay attention to any gang switches or outlets. You can generally have a maximum of 3 gang together before you're going to exceed that 24 square inches. So you might have to have multiple gangs that are separated from each other. All other penetrations within your rated assemblies must be sealed by fire stop material. And this is going to be mostly impactful to multifamily homes and semi-detached homes and zero lot line homes. So just pay attention to those walls that have that required fire rating to them. Next is outdoor intake and exhaust openings. So this change was brought about to align the building code with current requirements of the gas code for intakes and exhausts. You're going to require a separation from air intakes for mechanical ventilation from exhaust outlets that may contain contaminants such as gas vents, and they need to be you're going to have a separation of 1800 millimeters from those. So that's 5'11". So these air intakes will be for fixtures such as your HRVs, fresh air intakes, makeup air intakes, things like that. And then also with this, exhaust outlets that can discharge air that contains moisture. So these are going to be exhaust outlets that are for your dryer vent or bath fans, pieces like that. That one will have to be 1800 millimeters away from the air intakes and any vented soffits. And if any of these same exhausts are in a sidewall and within 1800 millimeters of a soffit, there's a portion of soffit that is going to be required to be unvented or blocked. And the dimension of this soffit will be based off of a new chart in the code. It does have a few lines, so definitely go have a look at these sections, get familiar with what these clearances are. And then this unvented soffit, if you have any vents that can be within the soffit itself, it will also apply to a certain portion of soffit to be unvented as well. Next is our installation of windows, doors, and skylights. So to note here, the building code has not changed, but the standard has. So all of your installation is going to need to meet the requirements of CSA A440.4-19. The PRTC has reviewed and identified some of the bigger changes within this standard. So some of those changes are the materials that are going to be used for shims. They must be now plastic, cedar, or treated plywood. I know many builders before were using scrap OSB, but we need to make sure that we're following this new standard. So again, plastic, cedar, or treated plywood for the shims. In this as well, subsill drainage is not required for most windows in Alberta unless the windows are mulled. If you do have a mulled window, this is going to always require subsill drainage. Subsill drainage is now going to be required under all doors, including patio doors. And there is a list of locations where this subsill drainage will not be required, which can be found in a table within this standard. So you will have to go find this standard and purchase it to be able to review these installation requirements. If a door or window is protected from precipitation, the subsill drainage will not be required. One of the changes as well, the perimeter of a window or door flange must be sealed to the water resistive barrier. And a description of approved sealants can be found within the standard as well. And last, no fasteners can be installed through flanges within 200 millimeters of the corners for any flanged windows. So again, shim materials may result in a change of practice for builders in the province. And there may be some cost savings if you're in a location that will not require subsoil drainage, but we also recommend working with your window suppliers to determine your best installation details for your home that are going to comply with these standards. Next up is required guards. So we have had some changes for when a guard is required to be installed. Previously, in what you're used to today, code required that the guard would be installed where your landing surface was greater than 600 millimeters from the adjacent grade, or if the adjacent grade within 1.2 meters of that surface had a slope of more than 1 and 2, you would require that guard as well. Now the code is going to require the guard where the surface is more than 600 millimeters between your adjacent walking surface and that landing area, but this is going to be within 1.2 meters. So they took away the slope portion out of the article. So if your grade 4 feet away from your surface is going to be more than 600 millimeters from your landing, you will require to install that guard. So code will now require the guards to be installed for that surface as well. So even when you get into the portions where you might not require a guard because you have, say, less than 3 risers, if that grade at the 4 feet is more than 600, you will still require that guard. The building code does have some further information and diagrams within the notes to Part 9. So please get in there, have a look for yourselves, get familiar with that part of what's coming up. Next up is window opening control devices. So everybody's calling them WOCDs. So when you hear that acronym, that's what this is. So we do have new requirements for WOCDs in the code. So any openable window more than 1800 millimeters above the floor or ground on the opposite side of the window, so you're outside, or less than 900 millimeters above your finished floor on the inside is going to require a guard or this WOCD. So what this does is it just limits the operation of the window to only open no more than 4 inches for some fall safety. At the time of publication, the new requirement did conflict with requirement for egress required windows to be able to be opened without tools or special knowledge. But earlier this April, there was a standata that was issued by Municipal Affairs that will allow a WOCD mechanism that complies with ASTM F2090 as a means of compliance in the egress required window. So that means you won't need to change the configurations of your windows for egress required in bedrooms, as long as you have a WOCD that meets the requirements of that standard. However, the variants or the standata will not be permitted for use in any adaptable or barrier-free dwelling units. So if you are building any of those types, just be mindful of the new changes to windows here. And then all building standata you can find through the government website. It's also going to be a good topic to review with your window suppliers to make sure that your homes are going to meet all required compliance for your windows. Next is fire resistance and fire protection ratings. So tables 910.3.1a and b have been updated in the building code along with the notes to these tables. So as you use these assemblies in your projects, it's going to be good to review and make sure you're still meeting all of the required ratings as they've changed, and make sure that you're meeting all of the notes within these tables as well. So like some of the notes may require you to change some of your construction practices. One of the major additions to table A is note 16, which now requires attachment of gypsum board on the interior side of an exterior wall assembly with fasteners to be spaced no more than 8 inches on center, and it will require all of the joints of the gypsum to be backed with blocking as well for attachment. So again, if you're working with any of the listed assemblies within the fire and sound resistance tables, have a look through, make sure your practices are gonna meet the requirements of these new changes. 8th on the list was equipment efficiency. So there have been many changes for equipment efficiencies in 936. Highlighting some of these, minimum equipment efficiency has increased to warm air furnaces from 92% AFUE to 95% AFUE. This change now aligns with NRCan's minimum requirements for changes that were effective December 12th, 2019, and would apply to new construction. All gas and electric forced air systems must now use ECM high efficiency motors. Service water heating equipment has changed from a measurement of EF to UEF as well. There's quite a few adjustments within the equipment. One specifically to note is that the gas instant systems may have slightly increased minimum performance requirements, especially when you get into the larger systems. So what this means, typically any builders that are using the performance compliance path for energy efficiency is going to see the most impact, as your reference house baseline will improve because of using that 95% efficient furnace versus the 92. So it's going to make it a little more challenging to meet or exceed energy targets of the reference house. So pay attention to those as you're working through your details and how you determine your wall assemblies and efficiencies of your homes. 9th on the list is air tightness. So there have been improvements have been made to this portion of the code. While the previous code penalized builders when air barrier details were used from 925.3 and testing was not conducted, the new edition no longer has this penalty, and it neutralizes the energy loss calculated due to air leakage between the proposed and the reference house. 936.6 is a new section that has been added that gives some substantial clarity around the use and targets for air tightness in all of the compliance paths. This also provides some clarity on the use of CGSB 149 for the determination of air tightness of building envelopes by the fan depressurization method. So this is your blower door testing. And both guarded and unguarded testing is now allowed. So modeling of the proposed home will have a maximum of 2.5 ACH for all home types and will no longer allow the use of 3.2 ACH or 925 air barrier details. Modeling of the attached homes can now use 3 ACH, which was previously 2.5 in the reference home model, which is going to allow for some increased air leakage at the party wall when you're using unguarded methods of testing. All other home types are still going to use the 2.5 ACH for the reference home models. So overall, there's been some substantial improvements to the clarity, the flexibility, and use of the air tightness testing in the compliance paths. The guarded and unguarded testing is also going to provide much flexibility for any builders that are building any type of attached homes. And last on the list was energy efficiency. So there have been various adjustments to 936 in this edition of the code. The biggest change is the addition of tiered energy performance. Scott's going to go into that in a little more depth after this. What's important for us today is that the province has decided to start with Tier 1, and that means that all municipalities must adhere to this. They do not get to choose a different tier. We are all going to play on the same level within Alberta. So under the compliance, clause 936.13.2 is unique to Alberta, and it deems that compliance with the subsections 936.7 or 936.8, and that's the prescriptive and performance paths of the tiered energy performance compliance. Under compliance in this section, all the tiered stuff, as long as you're Tier 1, meets all of the requirements of how we are currently working with performance and prescriptive compliance today. So there's going to be very little change to your current construction practices to meet the energy targets. However, if you do choose to go to a higher tier, there is going to be additional requirements in those tiers. So many of the other changes to 936 are going to make things a bit smoother for you as well. As an example, window U values have slightly increased. So just picking out zone 7A now will require a value of 1.61 versus the previous 1.6. It doesn't sound like much, but everything always helps a bit. So it shouldn't really change your products, but it'll slightly help the energy modeling if you are using the performance compliance paths. You will see some equipment's performance standards and references have been updated to use different metrics such as HSPF2, SEER2, and UEF. What this does is it aligns with the US suppliers, and it can help expand the product accessibility for us in Canada. And last in this section, the continuity of installation has been improved to provide further clarification regarding what is required when you're installing plumbing or electrical conduits in the exterior wall. So have a look at that. It's going to give you some clarity of what you need to do when you're insulating around any kind of conduits or plumbing that may be located in these assemblies. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Scott to talk about the tiered energy codes.
Awesome. Thanks, Greg. Yeah, great job kind of breaking down that stuff. And I see there have been some questions in the Q&A. So for folks, again, please, if you do have questions, don't hesitate to throw them in there. I see Keith is diligently trying to respond to the ones that he can, but we will hopefully I'll have Greg kind of go through those after we get done the crux of kind of the presentation here. Yeah, just to again give a bit of an overview of what the tiered energy codes are, where we are at, and where we're potentially going. For those not familiar, I think most are, but if you're not, this is intended by the federal government as a pathway to effectively mandating net zero construction for new homes. It's designed with tiers 1 through 5. Tier 1 would be kind of, again, current code, what we do right now. Tier 5 would be what they would consider effectively to be a net zero home. From Tier 1 up to Tier 5, effectively what we see are progressive increases to air tightness, increases in terms of requirements for insulation, windows, and the efficiency of mechanical systems. We looked through this in quite a bit of detail back in 2021 and 2022, and we developed what we called our tiered energy code roadmap, all available on our website. But as part of that process, when we went through it, it was pretty apparent that tiers 1 and 2 should be manageable for the majority of membership. Like, we didn't flag anything that seemed to be really difficult or overly kind of complex for people to kind of adapt to over time. Tier 3 is where we noticed we're going to see kind of a bit of a shift where the performance pathway and air tightness testing effectively becomes mandatory. And I say effectively because I believe there's still some work undergoing or work happening at the federal level to potentially look at bringing that back a prescriptive pathway for tier 3. But as of right now, my understanding is you're kind of limited to that performance pathway and air tightness testing as soon as we hit tier 3, which again is a bit of a shift. We know some builders are there, but not everybody is. And there's some capacity that needs to be built within the industry, within our energy advisor space and all of those things to make sure that we're able to do that. Tiers 4 and 5, frankly, in our view, require further thought before they make sense for Alberta. And I'll get into that in a bit, but if you can go to the next slide, Greg. So yeah, just to give you again a sense of what tiers 1 through 3 are. Tier 1, very close to current building code. For tier 2, again, you're looking at a slight increase in the energy improvement and the envelope improvement. Tier 3, again, a further increase in the energy and envelope improvement. But again, that big shift at tier 3 right now is a shift to performance compliance. Cost impact wise, tiers 1 and 2, again, very minimal by and large. Tier 3, we see about a 3,300 to a 4,400 cost impact. But we'll skip now and I'll give a bit of an overview of what tiers 4 and 5 look like. If you go to the next slide, Greg. So, Greg, I think you've got your, yeah, there you go. Perfect. So the major barriers we're seeing to tiers 4 and 5, significant cost impacts on housing construction. I'll go over that in a second. But even beyond the cost piece, there's some technological challenges that I think we're going to have to figure out provincially here in Alberta. One is it requires a shift to electrified home heat. And for those who aren't really following this super closely, effectively that requires us using a lot more heat pumps to heat our homes. And those have not been proven to work all that reliably in really frigid temperatures. I think minus 23 or 24 and cooler, there's some issues with reliability. There's also a discussion that needs to be had on whether we'll actually be increasing our greenhouse gas emissions. So if we move to electric home heat with a whole bunch of heat pumps that are tied into our grid, well, we still actually burn a lot of fossil fuels to generate our electricity. So you will actually likely be generating more greenhouse gas emissions than you would be using a high efficiency natural gas furnace, which doesn't make a ton of sense. Then there's the question of, do we have the capacity or the ability for our grid to accommodate a more broad shift to electrified home heating, even in the new construction market? And, I don't think we've been given an answer to whether that's possible or not. And I'm not an expert in this, by any stretch of the imagination, but that's one we pose to government and a lot of proponents in favor of this is we need to first understand whether our grid can actually handle this. Then we get into design impacts here. Then, at tiers 4 and 5, you're looking at external insulation. How's that going to work with kind of the narrow designs that we're doing nowadays? And then when we look at the retrofit side, how are we designing for solar panels, and are we doing it the way we need to in terms of retrofits? So next slide there, Greg. So for 4 and 5, the cost estimates we did, and these go back to 2022. So I'd argue they're probably out of date. So these costs, likely would be higher at this stage. Tier 4 would kind of be what would be considered a net zero ready home. Although I've also heard that you can potentially even meet a net zero home at tier 4. It's kind of confusing. There's no real defined lines on what's net zero or net zero ready. But in theory, tier 4 is kind of intended to be that net zero ready stage. But you're looking at a pretty significant energy improvement at greater than 40%, pretty significant envelope improvement. And then again, that big shift is electrified home heating. The major difference between tier 4 and tier 5, beyond again some of that insulation, the efficiency of your mechanical systems, that's where you're looking at again adding PV cells or some other form of renewable energy source to the home. So significant costs. Tier 4 are 20 to 22,000, and tier 5 is 70 to $77,000 a door. So we'll go to the next slide and talk about kind of BILD Alberta's recommendations. Before we do that, This is, again, all this information is available on our website. This was part of the roadmap that we put together. And it just, again, provides a bit of a breakdown of what happens at each tier. And, rather than just that cost impact, it may be more effective for you as a builder to look at what is the increase to construction costs. So we've got that column there that actually goes through it. This is all based off of modeling that we had some builders do with energy advisors, again, to try to assess what the impacts of each tier are. So again, effectively, that net zero ready, we anticipate that's a $20,000 to $25,000 impact at least. The net zero, that's probably a $70,000 to $80,000 impact. Next slide. So the recommendations we provided to the government of Alberta, and by and large to date, they've accepted those recommendations, and they're similar to recommendations that were also provided by the Building Subcouncil of the Safety Codes Council. But effectively, it's consistent application of the energy tiers province-wide. And this one was really important in BC. They do not have kind of this legislative framework in place. So you have municipalities adopting different tiers, and a lot of instances where builders are having to comply with 3 separate, effectively, building codes within the same kind of area that they do business in. It's created a ton of challenges for those builders, and we were pretty adamant from the early stages of this that wasn't something we wanted to see in Alberta. And that was largely agreed by our regulator, Municipal Affairs, and the government of Alberta. So the way that was done is obviously in code, they're adopting one tier. They're not enabling people to choose. But the other piece was they removed a clause from city charters, and a piece that we've been advocating for a while. But it removed that clause that allowed municipalities, or the 2 cities in particular, to choose their own energy tier. So all that means is effectively we're at tier 1 in Alberta, and that applies to every municipality. They cannot mandate you build to a tier above tier 1. We view tier 1 as kind of that launch pad to have the discussions like we're having today, to launch some additional education, some research, to build capacity, to support not only our builder, our trade members to move through the tiers, but also support our municipal jurisdictions, our safety codes officers to move through these tiers more effectively. So we think we can get to tier 2 within 1 to 2 years after tier 1. We want to do, again, a bunch of the education and capacity building this year at tier 1 to allow us to smoothly move to tier 2 again within a year or 2. Tier 3, kind of our feedback to government has been implementation is going to be dependent on whether we have the energy advisor capacity to make this work more broadly. And I don't think we're going to have much of a challenge necessarily in Edmonton or Calgary. I think there's some pretty solid capacity that's been built up there. What we're trying to figure out is that going to work effectively in some of our mid-sized cities or some of our more remote communities, and how do we address air tightness testing and a lack of energy advisors potentially in some of those markets, because the cost impact becomes pretty significant. Tiers 4 and 5, our view is that in their current state, they're not broadly feasible in Alberta, and that there are some significant questions that will need to be answered before we can support a move to any of those upper tiers as a minimum standard. We're open and willing and wanting to have those discussions, but frankly, at this point, based on the information we have, it's not something that we can currently support. Next slide, Greg. So where we're, I guess, at with all of this is implementation on May 1st. We've pulled together quite a bit of information in terms of education and resources for membership. All of it's on our website, but we've done a bit of a partnership with PHBI and the Safety Codes Council to produce a series of videos. The first one is up on our website, which provides an overview of the National Building Code 2023 NBC Alberta edition. The focus is largely on providing that intro to the tiered energy codes in a bit more detail. So more detail than we've kind of provided today. It gives you, again, a sense of what these are, what they're going to look like. We do have planned a series of videos over the next 6 to 7 months. They're going to touch on things like moving from performance to prescriptive, peak cooling loads, envelope improvements, air tightness testing, and multifamily home compliance. Next slide. So as I mentioned, yeah, all of this is on our website. So buildalberta.ca/building codes. In addition, this is where we'll put the webinar once we've recorded it and uploaded it. The video I just referenced and subsequent videos will all be there. We've prepared a guide based on the 10 key changes that Greg went over. That's available on the website. We've also compiled a series of 3-column documents that have been prepared by the government of Alberta, which basically shows kind of 2019 code, 2023 code, and then describes the change that's occurring between them. So it's a bit more detailed, but as you're looking at some of those detailed changes, those are really good resources to help you work through some of the changes that are happening. And then, of course, if you want a bit more of an understanding of what's happening with tiered energy codes, both now and into the future, we do have our tiered energy code roadmap also available on that site. So please do use that as kind of your resource and keep checking in there as we are continuing to add those resources. Sign up to our newsletter. That's where we try to keep everybody informed of any changes, especially any stand data, because we do expect more and more of those to come out in the weeks and months to come as we look at kind of adopting this province-wide. Next slide, Greg. So then lastly, before we jump into questions, so the code is continuing and always evolving. So while we're working at implementing the 2023 edition in Alberta, work is ongoing for the 2025 national code. And some of the changes at a high level are out for what's called public review. So where stakeholders such as ourselves are able to provide feedback to the federal government. And there's some pretty significant changes coming in what we anticipate to be the 2025 national code. That will include alterations to existing buildings. So some of the requirements associated with tiered energy codes that we talked about, likely we're going to see some of those implemented on alterations to existing buildings. So renovations. Not exactly sure what it's going to look like yet, but that's something we're monitoring really closely. The 2025 code is likely to also bring in different ways of calculating your emissions and putting in requirements on the operational greenhouse gas emissions of housing. Again, we're still trying to, I guess, figure out exactly what that's going to look like and if that makes sense or how that makes sense for Alberta. And then lastly, what could add some significant costs as well are accessibility standards and visitability. So for those with challenges from a mobility standpoint, they are looking at bringing in some minimum standards for accessibility into all new housing. So we're still trying to figure out exactly what those mean in terms of design changes and cost impacts. But we do plan on providing feedback to the federal government, not only through our national body, the Canadian Home Builders Association, but we'll be doing that directly as BILD Alberta. We will then also begin engaging with our provincial authorities within the municipal affairs to discuss what we might have to start thinking about from an Alberta standpoint. And then for the 2030 code, not a ton of work happening on it yet, but we expect in the near future, they will be looking at potentially embodied carbon requirements, further requirements for GHG in existing homes, and further requirements for accessibility and alterations surrounding accessibility. So this could all be subject to change, but that doesn't mean we can't continuing. Doesn't mean we don't have to keep focusing on it and working on it, and making sure we're representing members' behalf as this stuff's getting discussed at both the federal and provincial level. So with that, I think we'll maybe throw it back to questions. Greg, have the majority of questions, I think, been answered in chat, or are there some that maybe you want to call out?
There's some that are still, excuse me, there's some that are still unanswered there, but I can just kind of go through them all quickly just so we have it on the recording too.
Yeah, that'd be perfect.
So first, there was a question about the vertical vinyl application being attached to 7/16 OSB. The question was if stud spacing was allowed to be 400 millimeters. And yes, that is totally okay. Vertical vinyl application can be attached to the sheathing only as long as it's the 7/16 thick, and then the stud spacing behind it doesn't have any impact for the fastening of that. There was a question about exhaust vents within 1800 millimeters clearance. Does the clearance to vented soffits apply for vented soffits for a balcony system, or only vented soffits leading to an attic space? And 932.313 doesn't say anything specific about attic spaces. But a safety codes officer could decide that a soffit under a system, or safety code officer could decide that a soffit could be a soffit under the balcony system.
Okay.
I think, Keith, you have more to add to that.
Yeah, it would be an interesting question to ask a safety codes officer, because I know when they went through the code change request process 5 years ago, this was entirely about attic rain and about preventing moisture in attics. And so if that balcony system is not connected to your building envelope, like to your interior conditioned space, you could probably still put a vented soffit there. But one would wonder why you would want to put a vented soffit there. If it's not connected to anything, if it's not connected to your building envelope or ventilation space, then the better decision would be don't let any moisture in there, especially if it is a wood construction. Go put non-vented soffit in there, because you really don't want moisture in there anyway.
Perfect. Thank you, Keith. Next up was some questions. There's been a few questions about defining subsoil drainage for swing doors. Keith, you were talking about that one, so I'll let you field that one as well.
Yeah, so the subsoil drainage applies to every kind of door system. So if you have a patio door system that is not protected, you would need to have some kind of subsoil drainage. And so that could be something as a building wrap, like a Tyvek Typar kind of material. I know some jurisdictions in the area where I am, in the Edmonton area, allow Tyvek to be wrapped inside the building, the window opening, and that provides subsoil drainage. It could be a more complicated system like a peel and stick system. There's some great systems out there that work. But this applies to every unprotected door. So a door underneath an overhang, a large overhang, you could potentially argue with a safety codes officer that it is protected. But a patio door in the back of a house with no overhang would not be a protected door. A patio door, it's not a window, it's a door, must be protected.
Awesome, thank you. Next, there is a question with changes to the energy efficiencies, asking us to speak to the utilization of CMHC financing, the MLI program. So as an example, this builder has preliminary energy modeling from last year based on the 2019 code to better than the reference house by 40%. But at the time of building permit and submission and on-site testing, this will affect the percentage that they're going to be above the reference house. So I believe that if your building permit has been applied for prior to May 1 of this year, everything is going to work within the 2019 cycle of the building code. However, if your building permit is on May 1 or after of this year, all of these requirements are going to be based around the 2023 code. So you may need to look at adjustments to your building to achieve the higher percentages again within those programs. There is the question of approval of APA stamped sheathing for fastening of horizontal vinyl siding, complying with note 2 on table 2754A. Keith, you had said 92751 requires the cladding to be attached to the framing members or furring or blocking between the framing members. Then sentence 2 provides an exemption for vertical vinyl siding to not be attached to the sheathing, but it's only for vertical vinyl siding. Currently, there's no ability for horizontal attachment to meet the requirement. Again, the Vinyl Institute is performing testing. There is going to be more information to come once we get the results of this and determine some next steps from this testing. Next,
just one other comment there, Greg. The note in table A.
It was the
so 92754 table or 92754A under vinyl and insulated vinyl sheeting horizontally applied. There's a minimum nail length of 38 millimeters, so 1.5 inches minimum nail length or staple length of 38 millimeters. That must be attached to the furring members or framing members or blocking between the framing members. And that maximum nail or staple spacing is allowed to be 400 millimeters, 16 inches. And then there's a note number 2 that says the maximum spacing of 16 inches on center applies to nails and staples used to attach horizontally applied vinyl, insulated vinyl, and polypropylene siding, unless a greater spacing is permitted in an evaluation report prepared by an accredited certification organization. So there's no reference to, in the table, to APA stamped sheeting. All the sheeting on your home has to be stamped, has to be properly stamped anyway, CSA or APA. There is no reference to stamped APA sheeting there. That reference to sheeting is only for 92751, where vertical lumber, stucco lath, or reinforcing vertically applied vinyl siding are permitted to be attached to sheeting only, where the sheeting consists of not less than the lumber, the plywood, or the 11 millimeter OSB. So every home in Alberta is going to have board and batten siding and vertically applied siding at 24 inches on center. Oops, I said that out loud.
Thanks, Keith. Next, there's a question about the note that states a building will not be required to comply with 936.7 and 936.8. How does this affect Tier 1 compliance? So there is another sentence, 936.13 sentence 2, that's unique to Alberta. And what that does is it's stating that as long as you're meeting all of the requirements of your prescriptive compliance path or performance compliance path as you're utilizing the code today, that meets all of the requirements for Tier 1 of the new code coming into enforcement. So we don't really need to worry too much about Tier 1 as Alberta. It's only once you start choosing to go to other tiers that you're going to start seeing new requirements. Keith?
The big question here is, will your authority having jurisdiction inspect to that higher tier? That's a question you should ask your authority having jurisdiction. If that's what you want to do, you can certainly build to tier 2, 3, 4, and 5 in the National Building Code of Alberta or National Building Canada Alberta edition. You can certainly build to that, but will the authority having jurisdiction inspect to that and then certify that? It's a very important question that everybody should ask of their every builder should ask of their authority having jurisdiction.
Perfect. Thank you, Keith. Next was just a question about the tiered costs listed for single family homes and what the square footage was. So the answer was yes, the cost impact per home is based on modeling a 2,000 square foot detached home with about a 264 square foot garage. Next, there's a question on window installation. A note stating that the perimeter of the window or door flange must be sealed to a water resistive barrier. First question, does this include the sill flange? It's typically left open in the Alberta climate to allow for drainage of the subsill membrane. And question 2, does this mean the flanges must be sealed to the building wrap? Typically, the flanges are sealed to the sheathing with the building wrap lapped over it. It provides some redundancy for the system to drain. If sealed to Tyvek, any moisture that is behind the Tyvek from above can leak into the rough opening. Keith.
So window installation in most places in Alberta, unless you have a mold window, you do not need sub-sill protection. So that's a new change in the A440 document. That's not in the building code. That's in the A440 document. Every builder should have a copy of the A440. It's a couple $100. It's not free like the building code. So, and I'm generalizing here, so I know we're all across Alberta, but the A440 says if you have a non-mold window, so not a window where you have two pieces of window together and there's a crack in that window. So if you have one frame and that window goes into that opening, it might be a picture casement, but it's inside one frame. There are manufacturers that make that. That window does not need sub-sill protection. So that's one thing. The other part I think this person is asking is window insulation. There is no requirement for those in the A440 for that the sides and the top of that window to be sealed with a peel and stick. Now I know that is how many builders are installing it, and yes, if you are using that method, you should not be putting peel and stick on the bottom of the window nailing flange, because you do want to have the water to drain out any vapor that is in that home that is getting into that space. You want it to drain out. And yes, typically the peel and stick is attached to one of the methods that I've used is put the window in, put peel and stick around, put your Tyvek around, peel and stick that Tyvek to the peel and stick as well. So there's a two system there, but that's not described in the A440 document. That's outside of the A440 document. Good building practice.
Awesome. Thank you, Keith.
So, yeah, I think there's one last question there.
Yeah, there's just the one last question here. With penetration of fire separations, the question was, would using an aero barrier for penetrations improve the tightly fitted requirement? And the answer to that one is no.
Well, the simple answer is no, or the complex answer is no. 910, 916, 910, 96. So these are all the new requirements in zero lot lines, in attached housing, firewalls, fire separations, all that kind of stuff. They all need to be rated systems. So putty packs, whatever you are sealing that, if the hole is bigger than what's allowed in the code in the 910.9.6, you can't just spray air barrier in there and call it good, because that is not a rated system. The sealing must be done with a sealed by a fire stop that, when subjected to the fire test method in CAN ULC S115 standard method of fire test for fire stop systems, has an F rating not less than the required fire resistance rating for the fire separation. Air barrier does not have a fire rating system. It doesn't have a tested system. So no, you couldn't use that.
Awesome. Thanks, Keith. So that looks like it ends all of the questions that we have.
Yeah, so thank you everybody for joining and asking your questions. As we mentioned, we put the link to our website and the resource page for building codes. Please visit it. Sign up for our newsletter if you aren't already. That's where all this information is getting disseminated. This video and all the others we're preparing will be available on that website for people to kind of look at and review or send off to others that they need to know. So beyond that, don't hesitate to reach out to us if you have further questions, and we'll do what we can to answer them. But thank you very much for everybody for attending. See ya.